Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
No te metas, no te metas. Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. No te metas, no te metas. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. No te metas. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
Que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Se respeta, se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano.
Se respeta, se respeta.
No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
Se respeta, no te metas. De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda.
Nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
One second. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast. Very first episode, inaugural episode for the Week of Action in Defense of Cuba, organized by the National Network on Cuba. And this is a National Network on Cuba production. My name is Onya Sanu. I am one of the co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, and we started this program, the comrades you see on this screen, because we wanted to have a virtual platform to talk about the rapidly escalating U.S. war against Cuba, what Cuba is doing to respond, and how the U.S.-Cuba Solidarity Movement, and really the entire U.S.-Cuba Solidarity, or the entire Cuba Solidarity Movement, can work together, can build our unity, can build our collaboration to take out this blockade once and for all. And so, as I mentioned, my name is Onya Sanu. I am one of 5 co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba. The National Network on Cuba is over 65 social justice organizations united in our opposition to U.S. government attempts to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. I am joined here by 2 revolutionary, wonderful co-hosts who I will allow to introduce themselves. I'm going to pass it to Jasenia.
Thank you, Comrade Oni. My name is Jasenia. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm humbly and gratefully, here today with my other comrades on this call. And as Comrade Onye Sanu said, we'll be talking more on how to, deepen the ties within the Cuban solidarity movement here within the belly of the beast. We'll be talking a bit about what's happening, globally in the international community, and how that all connects to us having to, challenge and finally get rid of Western imperialism, especially Yankee-led imperialism, because it's literally bringing an amount of pain and suffering that is unfeasible, and it is unwarranted, and we can't continue living in a world where our children are more fearful to look up at the skies than to play with one another in peace. So I think that today we're going to be in community and discussion with one another, and I'm looking forward to being here and not to yap too much, and to pass it to my comrade Ermia. I am a member of various anti-imperialist organizations, and I also organize with the ACC, the Action for Cuba Committee, the New York, New Jersey chapter, which is a working group of the National Network on Cuba, and also a member of BP, Venceremos Brigade. So I'm happy to be here, and I will pass it to my comrade Ermia.
Hello, friends. Hello, comrades. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to my two comrades who introduced themselves prior to me. My name is Ermia. I live in Washington, D.C. I am also an organizer with the Action for Cuba Committee, which was born out of the 2025 May Day Brigade, which all of us actually here served as May Day Brigadistas on. And I am also a part of various different anti-imperialist organizations. And I'm very excited for us to be starting this podcast because I look forward to being able to discuss the global majority movements that are happening and what kind of resistance is taking place to U.S. empire. So I'm going to pass it back to my comrade Onya.
I think you're actually first up, Ermia, with the update on Iran.
Awesome. Well, I think with, Iran, the first thing that I kind of wanted to start off discussing is that in the past couple of weeks, we've seen an escalated campaign of attacks on Iran by the United States, right? What started off as an Israeli-U.S. bombing of a girls' elementary school in Minab, which killed almost 200 children, shamefully. It quickly became a series of growing violence by the imperialist powers and the destruction of oil facilities that have resulted in deliberate and irreversible environmental and health impact. Images out of Tehran that we've seen in the past week show horrific scenes of poisonous smoke that has completely blacked out the sky. It's caused oil rain, which has caused catastrophic fires in the city. And the impact that these attacks will have on the environment and Iran's future generations and their health it's undeniable, right? And these attacks on the livelihood of Iranian people and Iran's sovereignty, however, is no surprise. Iran for many decades has been a strategic target for the United States and Israel. It is widely recognized as the heart of resistance that has stood the most steadfast against any U.S. aggression and has provided a lifeline to anti-imperialist movements all over the region and all over the world, really. And it's important for us to remember the history and material reality of Iran as we understand today's conditions. When the Iranian people waged their revolution, because it was a people's revolution in 1979, the country had been a playground for the US to stage coups d'etats against their democratically elected leaders and to prop up a dictator monarch who I think a lot of people forget his alliance was with the Nazis and American imperialism. And since the People's Revolution in Iran, the Iranian people have engaged in great sacrifice and discipline in countering US hegemony, with every aspect of the Iranian economy structured towards fueling resistance that defends our homelands and being on the front lines in the struggle for a liberated Palestine. And, It's certainly true that Iran has oil that America would love to have control over, as many have already pointed out. But even more crucial is that Iran will not bow down to the boot of the US. And even more crucial is that Iran has been providing refuge to Black and brown revolutionaries while the US provided refuge to Nazis, right? And so Iran is a target now, not because it poses any genuine threat to any people of the world, but because it poses a threat to empire. And as the Iranian Western diaspora, Vatan Furushes is what we call them, which means homeland sellers in Farsi, cheer for the destruction of our people and culture, Iranian people in Iran have hit the streets en masse, demonstrating the rejection of US interference and the information warfare that has incorrectly framed them as needing saving by the West. We witnessed this same propaganda warfare towards Cuba and Venezuela as the US has amped up its attacks in the Caribbean. And they've used the diaspora of all these countries to help build consent for such military aggression. So Onia and Jasenia, I now turn to you. Onia, talk to me about the importance of anti-imperialist organizers and progressive people more broadly standing in solidarity with Iran. How can we challenge the imperialist narratives against Iran at this moment?
Thanks so much, Amir, for that incredible grounding. And I also want to make sure, this is our first show. We're doing it live. And so if you have any issues hearing us or seeing us, or if you hear an echo, put it in the chat and we will troubleshoot. Just wanted to get that disclaimer out of the way as we work out the kinks of this program. But that was like a really, really excellent grounding, Ermia, to understand precisely why the US government is attacking Iran. I feel like we have to understand what you laid out, that Iran has provided political and material support to national liberation struggles, to the anti-imperialist movement, to the socialist movement, including to Cuba. Cuba and Iran have very, very good relations. And that is precisely why the US is going for Iran in this moment, because they want to secure their hegemony over the planet. And Iran is a bulwark against imperialism in the Middle East, just as Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua have been bulwarks against imperialism in the Western Hemisphere in Turtle Island. And so we really have to recognize as Cuba Solidarity Forces that we have to see the connections between these struggles, between Iran's struggle against Zionists and US intervention. Like, it's really like an existential battle for Iran, because the US, multiple US officials have expressed the desire to destroy Iran society, destroy the Iranian government. But then we also have to recognize that our enemy understands these struggles as connected. They understand the blockade on Cuba, the oil blockade on Cuba, the invasion of Venezuela, the occupation of Haiti, the drone warfare in Haiti, the war in Iran, the occupation of Palestine, the genocide in Gaza. It's all different fronts in a global counter-revolution, and we're only going to be able to stop it by building strategies based on that understanding.
That's right. So Jasenia, talk to me. Has the resistance been weakened as painted by the US media? What is the sentiment that's coming from Iranians in Iran?
No, the sentiment of resistance hasn't been weakened at all. If anything, it's been strengthened even more. The United States is a very, immature, juvenile, and has a tendency of infantilizing liberation movements and believing that we can't acquire our self-determination and, be able to govern over ourselves in a way that is just and peaceful with one another. So this is why they do imperialist aggression, because they believe that the influence that they can have over our democratic societies, as we see Iran and Venezuela and Cuba and so many other countries that are constantly, threatened and aggressed by the imperialist empire of the United States. We see that the people come out and they continue to resist and they continue to rise, and that's what's happening currently in Iran. They made a big mistake in the sense of believing that if they granted martyrdom to Imam Sayyid Ali Khamenei, that would weaken, the resilience and the resolve of the Iranian people, and this would somehow, demoralize them, so that they won't continue to resist against Israeli aggression, against Israeli imperialism and Zionism, and will stop, providing not only like material and financial, but also spiritual support to our Palestinian and Sudanese and Congolese brothers and sisters who are currently facing, a genocide that is being led by this axis of evil bloc composed of the United States and Israel and other nations in the global north. It's something that won't happen, will never happen, inshallah. And as we know, Allah is always on the side of the oppressed, and the tear of a person who is oppressed literally hurts Allah. So imagine how many tears have been shed to get to this point where the son of martyred Imam Ayatollah Sayyid Ali, Ayatollah, and I'm probably going to butcher his name, and I'm sorry, Mujtaba Kahmani, said that he's not going to, he's going to lift the fatwa on nuclear war weapon development so that they can better defend themselves. And they're also, doing discussions with other revolutionary socialist nations to strengthen this axis of resistant bloc. So if anything, the United States just ended up, doing a huge favor to giving more motivation to the resistance movement so that we actually focus our efforts to finally bringing an end to the genocides, but also finally bringing an end to Yankee-led imperialism and Zionism once and for all by any means.
Yeah, it looks like the media is kind of painting the fact that the idea that, the resistance has been weakened, or a majority of Iranians are kind of celebrating these attacks. But realistically, when we look at the voices coming from Iran, we can see that the overwhelming majority of Iranians are steadfast in their anti-imperialist resistance, right? So both of you talk to me, what are the implications of these attacks on Iran for all imperialized nations, including Cuba and Venezuela? Just you kind of mentioned that this is a pattern of attacks that are happening, and it wasn't isolated. It came after they kidnapped Maduro. It came after continuous economic warfare on Cuba. So what are the implications now that it's become even more aggressive on Iran?
I would say that the world has really been, particularly like in the past 5 years, waking up to the reality that the U.S. is not a rational global actor. That you cannot depend on the U.S. not to flip on you in increasingly violent ways, that even if you attempt, as many Caribbean governments are futilely now, to build peaceful relations with the United States, the U.S. will flip on you on a dime if its own geopolitical interests, its own desire to control resources and territories comes into conflict with your liberation as a nation. And so now I think the example of Iran, because really they were very, very patient, very, very disciplined, and very, very open to negotiation, to the point of agreeing to terms that they really they didn't have any reason to do that. Like, the U.S. did not get to define whether Iran can research or develop nuclear energy. The U.S. doesn't even get to define if Iran can have a nuclear weapon. Who decided that the U.S. gets to make that call? But Iran was willing to work with them because the rest of the world just wants to live in peace. They just want to have control of their own resources and meet their people's needs. And over and over and over again, the U.S. and Western imperialism more broadly just keeps messing with people. And I really feel like Iran was like, we are going to try to make it work. But if you are not willing to work with us peacefully, we are going to show you that you're going to leave us alone. And I really feel like that kind of energy is extremely important. We are at a point in history where the capitalist imperialist system is destroying the planet that we need to live. Our long-term survival as a species is in question, both from catastrophic climate change, but also through nuclear proliferation. And so it is time to draw a line in the sand and say that this system that is attacking Cuba, that is attacking Iran, that's attacking African indigenous nations, that's really destabilizing the planet, is no longer sustainable, that we are not going to accept being bullied to keep it going, that we are going to come together to defend each other, and that we have the right to define how we organize our societies, whether they be socialist or whether it be Iran's systems of government and system of state. The U.S. is not the boss of the world, and I'm so glad, so grateful that Iran stood up to them on behalf of the entire movement against imperialism, against colonization, against capitalism.
Yes, indeed. And it seems like, there's a lot of conversation, both globally, but among the US left around, the structure of Iran's government and what exactly, the kind of revolution that took place in 1979, its effectiveness, and whether it was really a people's revolution or not. And, I think it's undeniable that people in Iran recognize their revolution as something that they defend, as something that they stand steadfast for. So, talk to me, what about the fact that Trump himself said the exiled monarch's son, Reza Pahlavi, himself was deeply unpopular in Iran? I think we see a lot of videos of Iranian diaspora, certainly here in Washington, D.C., there was demonstrations of them holding up Reza Pahlavi as some kind of popular leader who should be reinstated as the monarch in Iran. So what are our thoughts that even Trump himself, as the head of imperialism, said, actually, no, he's not that popular?
I mean, I can answer this. I mean, the fact that Trump is even giving opinion as to regards to like who's a popular leader or who's not a popular leader is hypocritical, and it's asinine at best, to be honest, because he shouldn't be passing any judgment as somebody who is immoral and corrupt himself, as we see with what's happening, unfortunately with the Epstein files, and what happened to all those innocent children and women and men. We see his name come up constantly, being associated not only with official like political leaders of nations, but also presidents of corporations that are actually manufacturing and continuing to financially benefit from the atrocities that we constantly have to be forced to see with every passing day. So the fact that Trump is even saluting or praising any sort of leader, it just speaks to the character of what the Shah that was banished and pushed out by the people, because it was a people's revolution that happened in 1979, and it was the will of the people in order to establish an Islamic republic. That was what they decided amongst themselves. And there are things that happen under every single government, because we are human. We are fallible. We are not infallible. Not everything is perfect, but the constant thing that we see in countries and nations like Iran, like Cuba, like in Venezuela, I have some thoughts about that, and we can talk a bit more later. Is that they are willing to criticize, self-criticize, and do rectification. They're willing to bring about change within their society, because they listen to the demands and the voices of their people, and they put that first. And this is something that the United States, since the forceful creation of the settler colony that was very violent and brutal, and still the indigenous nations and the indigenous people of this settler colony haven't received their land back, and haven't received apologies and justice for the atrocities that they have been forced to endure through generations. We see that the Iranian people, what they want is to be able to live in peace, and whether that be through establishing the Islamic Republic and having that solely as how they decide to be, well, mashallah, that's the way it should be. And for Trump to say that the Iranian people are being forced to adhere to an Islamic government, Islam is not compulsory. You are not forced to practice something if it is not what your heart calls you to. So to the fact that more than 90% of the Iranian people are practicing Muslim, and Shia is the denomination that is practiced there, subhanAllah, that's what was to be bestowed amongst the people. Who is the United States to come and tell an entire group of people, an entire nation, an entire republic, that we want you to be one way because we want your natural resources? Just enter dialogue and see what it is that you can trade and what measures up and what doesn't measure up. But the United States has never done that because that's not in their character. So what we see now is, and as we've been talking about with, throughout this conversation, it is a revolutionary resolve that is never going to go away, and the Shah is not going to come back, inshallah, because this is what the people do not want. They do not want the Shah, and they want to continue establishing their nation under the leadership of the Ayatollah that they have elected and that has been selected by the Imam Sayyid Ali that was just martyred. And yeah, that's just a reality that the Yankees are going to have to come to accept one way or another. And if it's not through dialogue, then we're going to have to be in longer meetings. But other than that, yeah, I don't really see anything else that makes sense from whatever this administration has to say in regards to how nations govern themselves.
Great. Yes, thank you for that, Comrade Jasenia. And Onia, we now turn to you to give us some updates on Cuba.
Thanks so much, Jasenia. So as we mentioned in the previous segment, the U.S. has escalated the blockade against Cuba with the imposition of an oil blockade. It is multifaceted. There was an executive order issued on January 29th of this year in which the Trump administration defined Cuba as an extraordinary threat to the United States. Absurd, but also said that they would impose 50% tariffs on the imports of any nation that sells oil to Cuba. So Mexico, for a long time, has been a great friend of Cuba and also one of Cuba's primary suppliers of oil. And so that 50% tariff threat successfully threatened Mexico away from selling oil to Cuba. The Supreme Court has since struck down the Trump administration's ability to use what's known as IEEPA tariffs to impose that blackmail on nations selling oil to Cuba. But because the situation is rapidly changing and so unstable because the U.S. is an irrational actor, it's very important to understand that despite the tariffs being struck down, countries are still not risking selling oil to Cuba because they do not want to risk blowback from the United States. So there's that economic and legal dimension threatening countries away from selling oil to Cuba, but there's also a military dimension, meaning that the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy are straight up intercepting ships sent by foreign governments to bring oil to Cuba. So it's happened a couple of times. They intercepted a ship from Colombia that was trying to bring oil to Cuba just 75 miles away from the coast of the island. It was turned away by the U.S. Coast Guard. A similar thing actually just happened to a Russian oil ship. Russia was a nation that was down to risk the wrath of the United States because, quite frankly, the U.S. can't sanction Russia no more. As a matter of fact, they're rolling back some of the sanctions on Russia right now because their unprovoked attack on Iran threatened the entire global oil supply, and Europe is suffering. And so now the United States has decided to ease sanctions on Russia to allow European nations to buy Russian oil to address the situation that the U.S. created with its hubris, but still not letting Russian oil get to Cuba. They intercepted that ship as well. And so, yeah, right now there is still a total oil blockade on the island. And I, of course, would be remiss to mention that one of the other major suppliers of oil to Cuba was Venezuela. And of course, Venezuela has itself suffered violent U.S. intervention with the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores on January 3rd. Since then, no Venezuelan oil has made it to Cuba, and the U.S. has, in fact, taken control of Venezuela's oil sales, and they are straight up stealing the money, including selling Venezuela's oil to the Zionist entity in occupied Palestine and providing material and economic support to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So the impact of this U.S. attempt to completely cut off Cuba's oil is catastrophic on the island. As Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel said, not allowing a single drop of fuel to enter our country will affect transportation, food production, tourism, children's education, and the entire healthcare system. The objective is clear. As always, just like the Mallory memo said, the United States government is attempting to bring great suffering and destruction into the day-to-day lives of regular Cuban people to attempt to make them suffer so much that they rise up and overthrow their revolution. As we have seen over the past 60 years of this genocidal economic blockade, in which each escalation of it, that is a futile objective. Like, the Cuban people are never going to overthrow their revolution. They built it brick by brick. It improved their lives materially. And so blackmail to make them suffer is just not gonna work. It's just going to, like in the case of Iran, unite them in defending it. And so Cuba's response as a revolutionary and scientific socialist society is to organize itself to meet its people's needs in response to these escalated threats from the U.S. government, in response to the U.S. oil blockade. One thing I want to say before I get into how Cuba is responding is that it's very important to understand they've been here before. The United States always seizes upon opportunities in moments of global instability to escalate attempts to repress nations resisting imperialism, whether it be Iran and the maximum pressure campaign of sanctions during COVID-19, or the similar situation with Cuba during the first Trump administration, where again during COVID-19, the Trump administration applied over 200 additional sanctions, and then in 2019, placed Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list. And that placing of Cuba on the State Department's state sponsors of terrorism list is actually where we see the initiation of this oil blockade. It did not start in January. It actually started in the first Trump administration. They went directly for Cuba's oil imports. By placing Cuba on the SSOT, they cut off Cuba's access to international banking, to lines of credit, to loans, and even to cash, meaning that Cuba was not able to pay for the oil that it needed to import. And at the same time as the Trump administration was escalating those sanctions on Cuba, going for Cuba's oil imports, they were also escalating attacks on the PSUV in Venezuela. So the seeds for what is happening now have been sown through presidential administrations, because the Biden administration rolled back nothing. They kept it all in place. And so Cuba has been under this exact kind of pressure for quite some time. So, like I said, Cuba is scientific socialist. They do not sit and wait for rescue. They organize to address the needs of their people, because that is the priority of Cuba's society. And so Cuba has announced sweeping fuel rationing measures designed to protect essential services like healthcare, like education, like food production, like water purification. So right now they have a government-wide, statewide plan in place to prioritize fuel for those essential industries. They are also strictly limiting sales to private drivers and industries. And they are working to secure vital foreign currency by ensuring that the tourism industry is prioritized. You can still travel to Cuba, and it's very important that we do so and support the Cuban government. So we're going to talk about the Nuestra América Convoy a little bit later in the show, but you can still travel to Cuba, and it's important that we do so because that provides Cuba with necessary foreign currency. Schools are also maintaining their full in-person schedule, primary education schools, but universities are in a hybrid system where some students are taking classes online, again, just to conserve energy. In addition to these society-wide rationing measures, we are also seeing like an extremely rapid transition to sustainable energy in the form of solar power in Cuba, because you cannot blockade the sun, baby. And so the Cuban government correctly recognized that the dependency on foreign oil was a point of weakness, a place that the U.S. empire could attack to harm Cuba. And so they are prioritizing a rapid transition to solar energy backed by international solidarity from communist China, where now they have 38% of their energy during the day being generated by solar power. And they have a long-term goal of having 24% of all of the country's electricity being generated by renewable sources, including solar, by 2030. They are on pace to achieve that goal. And again, that is thanks to scientific socialist organization, the only way that Cuba has survived this blockade and all the different escalations of the United States. So the situation in Cuba is really, really dire. Really, the situation globally is really, really dire. And I want to get into this a little bit, comrades. We see the United States trying to punish Mexico for trading with Cuba, trying to blackmail countries away from supporting Cuba. We see that they have invaded Venezuela, stole its oil, and sold it to Zionist Israel to support the genocide in occupied Palestine. Mia, is this the clearest recent proof that U.S. imperialism and the so-called rules-based international order just means rules for thee and not for me?
Well, Comrade, I think you said it perfectly. I think the U.S. has always been a rules for thee, not for me nation. I think anytime they talk about human rights or the ability to run their own country in the way they seem fit, it's all hypocrisy. They are over in the Caribbean, not only bombing these ships and taking away all of the sovereignty that the Cuban people are fighting for and the Venezuelan people are fighting for. Let us not forget that President Maduro, who was kidnapped by the United States regime, was a democratically elected president by the vast majority of Venezuelans. And after his capture, the Venezuelan people came out in the streets en masse saying, we want our president back. How dare you come here and try to disrupt our sovereignty? And so I think when we look at what the U.S. is doing, we understand that it's incredibly hypocritical. It does not believe in the value of human life, as we've seen them just bomb, close to 200 children in Iran. It does not believe in the value of sovereignty. It thinks that it can go into any nation and simply take their resources, exploit their people, exploit their land, exploit their economic infrastructure. And we have to question ourselves, if they are against socialism, if they think socialism doesn't work, if they think scientific socialism is not the answer for people's advancements and prosperity, then why exactly do they need to continue invading these socialist nations in order to have oil or in order for their economy to survive? It's because they know that these socialist nations, revolutionary societies, are the answer to the people's advancement. And so I think we have to challenge these narratives and recognize that in the eyes of the public, the U.S. has completely lost legitimacy. It's lost legitimacy in whether or not it can be a serious country, whether or not, it has its own ability to thrive without plundering the resources of the global South. The global majority is really what they are. And we have to understand that it doesn't matter who they put on the state sponsor of terrorism list. America is the biggest exporter of terrorism in the entire world, right? We live right here in the belly of the beast. We live where the heart of terrorism is created and exported. So I think we have to recognize that we live in the most reactionary, the most backwards, and the most violent nation on this planet.
Absolutely. First of all, nails. I just saw them. I got a glimpse of them and I was like, yes. Okay. But also correct. Like this, the United States is the #1 purveyor of global terrorism. And so the claim that Cuba itself is a state sponsor of terrorism, while Cuba is exporting doctors, is exporting international solidarity, and the United States is bombing school children and has a very large percentage of its elected officials going to pedophile islands. Like the idea that like this entity is supposed to be like the moral arbiter, like the world's police, is actually absurd. But the propaganda against Cuba, against anti-imperialist nations like Iran, like Palestine, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like the Alliance of Sahel states, it is relentless for those of us living in the United States. We are constantly hearing messaging about how Cuba is on the brink of collapse, how communism and socialism have failed in Cuba, how the people want change. And now we are seeing the capitalist media in the United States looking at the situation on the ground in Cuba and using it to draw conclusions about the failure of the revolution. So in this period where Cuba is facing daily blackouts, where they are having to do triage of essential medical services to decide who gets care because they do not have the power to give everybody care because the United States, during this period of escalated economic warfare, Jasenia, how do we ensure that the world understands that these things happening are not failures of Cuba or the Cuban Revolution, but wounds deliberately inflicted by U.S. aggression?
Yeah, I think Comrade Mia said it very beautifully in terms of like, ensuring that we are calling attention to, the imperialist aggressions that are happening, and very clearly saying it, and in the way that you phrased it, that this government is composed of literal like pedophiles, right, that are exerting an inhumane amount of aggression onto a people who are just trying to bring about the completion of the ongoing Cuban Revolution that didn't even begin in, around 1898. It began the very first day that the Spaniard vampires set foot in Cuba. So this is a revolutionary resolve that is very rooted in, the hearts and the minds and the souls of the Cuban people, and calling attention to the fact that a very humble and friendly nation is constantly being attacked by an illegal entity, because the United States and Israel share that very much in common intrinsically with one another. The fact that they consistently do imperialist aggressions solely because, as it was declared when the Mallory Memo was created in the 60s, that they want to, sow dissent within the Cuban people so that they go against the Cuban Revolution. And at that time, it was to bring about the decline and the fall of Castro. And this is all because they want to hold control again of the natural resources, it being, sugar, and now, as we see, the agricultural industry that Cuba has been able to develop despite, the imperialist aggressions, and are able to sustain themselves through the tourism sector, which allows them to, have consistently international delegations and relationships with other comrades and friends of the nation to consistently, resist the isolation that the United States is trying to manufacture to bring about the so-called plunder of the Cuban Revolution and Cuba as a whole, to revert it back to Bautista's very debauchery and immoral dictatorship. And as we see, we have to consistently call attention to the fact that the United States is encroaching itself in Cuba because it wants to control the natural resources, but also is doing this across the Caribbean and Latin America. And as we see in Africa, they consistently put puppet governments, and I'll speak a bit about, the ridiculous Shield of the America Summit that unfortunately happened, but it's something that, it's so what we are saying consistently is very hypocritical of the United States to not leave nations alone. So it's something that we should consistently talk about in order to bridge these connections, but also highlight the fact that resistance is possible, as we're seeing in the Sahel states of the AES, federation, with the resistance that we see with the Palestinian Islamic resistance and the Palestinian resistance front, and also now in Iran, where they said you want to have peace discussions, but you can't start a war that you can't finish. So essentially, the response that the Iranian Islamic Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran is giving is warranted, and as Cuba has done in the past, the ability to defend itself is something that is not unbeknownst to the people. They don't want to fight. They don't want to fight. They say consistently that the American people, whatever that means, we can have a discussion about that later. They don't want to hurt the people that live within the belly of the beast. And this is something that all resistance and revolutionary movements have been saying. The enemy is just the Epstein government, or the cannibalistic, pedophilic, and immoral and corrupt government and ruling class that unfortunately is here in the belly of the beast, but also globally. So highlighting all of those things is important. And then also understanding that this is done to allow for all of these atrocities and this unregulated immoral behavior to continue. And unfortunately, Cuba is one of the nations that has to constantly be at the front to defend itself against these aggressions. Long-winded answer, but very important to mention all of that.
Cool, thanks so much, Yesenia, and great answer. Also, when you were talking, it reminded me of one Gustavo Petro, who, by the way, was not at the Shield of the Americas Summit. They were very intentional about who was there and who was not there. But he gave a speech after meeting with Trump where he said a clan of pedophiles is trying to destroy Colombia's government. And I was like, correct. Not an exaggeration. Straight up a clan of pedophiles. Anyway, something I forgot to mention in my grounding remarks is that with the illegal and unprovoked attack on Iran by the United States and the Zionist entity, we are seeing the entire global oil supply threatened. They have forced Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz so it cannot be used as a vector of attack against them, and that is impacting the global oil market. And one of the regions that's feeling that most acutely is Asia, and some news came out recently that governments in Asia have issued work from home orders to workers in their nation simply because they cannot guarantee the oil supply needed to generate the power for the workers. And it's very interesting because that's very similar to the situation that Cuba has found itself in, thanks to the oil blockade, thus the cutting off of all oil imports to Cuba. The Cuban government has been forced to impose rationing of electricity in order to make sure that the oil is prioritized for essential services. So the U.S. is choking Cuba, it's looting Venezuela, it is causing a global crisis by attacking Iran and forcing them to close the Strait of Hormuz. So Armia, how do we use these imperialist contradictions impacting the working class all over the world to build solidarity across borders?
Well, I think firstly, here in America, we need to organize. Right? We need to hit the streets. We need to engage in political education. We need to counter these imperialist lies. We need to really, what we need to do is act on the calls from the global South, which is those of you in North America, those of you in the belly of the beast, in America, you have a duty to fight back against your reactionary, Epstein, pedophilic, violent government. Mm-hmm. And so all of us here in the US, whether we are progressives, whether we are anti-imperialist organizers, whether we're a part of the women's struggle, the Black and brown struggles, the queer struggle, the trans struggle, whatever it may be, we are all working class and oppressed people. And we have to recognize that we have a common enemy with everybody in the global South who is currently experiencing exploitation, violence, bombs, killing, looting from the US. I mean, let's not forget, here in America, we still don't have healthcare. While in Israel, a country that we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars to every single year, they have healthcare. They have free healthcare. And so we have to recognize that the struggle for a world that's free from imperialism is the struggle of working class and oppressed people. And the only way we can achieve that is through disciplined, is through militant, and is through revolutionary organization. And so there's so many orgs around this country that are engaging in that work. It's important that everybody get plugged in and to put their efforts towards building a movement, a real fighting anti-imperialist movement here in America.
Perfect answer. Thank you so much, Armia. And also, if you are already in an organization organizing the working class, fighting for justice, resisting imperialism, and you're not in the national network on Cuba, why don't you visit NNOC.org/about, learn more about us, fill out the form, and join us. Let's build a broad, diverse, united movement against the U.S. attempts to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and attack working class people all over the planet. But now we're going to hear about what's going on in Nuestra América, and for those updates, I'm going to pass it to Yesenia.
Thank you so much, Comrade Onye. And yeah, as we've been talking, the United States reactionary government and the Trump administration, the pedophilic clan of men and women that compose that cabinet have decidedly, began 2026 by continuing the bastardization legacy of launching imperialist aggressions against democratically sovereign nations, as we've been talking about, and condemning, rightfully so, the illegal kidnapping of democratically elected Presidente Nicolás Maduro, and also first combatant Celia Flores, who are still, till this day, in a concentration camp in Brooklyn, New York, after the very I have my reservations, rightly so. The strange anomaly that is the mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, who met with Trump a few weeks before the imperialist aggression was launched against Venezuela, which left and killed over 100 people, in which 32 Cuban combatants were martyred defending Nicolás Maduro before he was kidnapped, forcefully transported to Puerto Rico, which is also an occupied nation that is used as a military playground by the United States to develop weapons that are being used to continue the genocide in Palestine and Sudan, and has also historically been used to launch and actually bomb nations that we do not in the past, historically, as we saw during the Vietnam War, and then also the Korean American War, unfortunately. And this is the constant tactic and essentially the character of the United States. It is to invade nations, as we are saying, to invade countries, to occupy their natural resources, because they have an inability to be able to, forge a path of peace and sovereignty through dialogue, of which many foreign ministers and diplomats of various nations, especially Venezuela, have said that they're willing to enter conversations. And Ivan Gil actually called for an end to the unilateral, cohesive measures that are being forced against Venezuela when he addressed the UN in Geneva. And I have thoughts about the UN as being, also it is something that is very useful to connect the international community with one another, but as we see, it is constantly being manipulated and forced to act against the wishes of the international community, as we see with the United States constantly and Israel and other nations that are occupied by the United States, to vote against resolutions to end the blockade against Cuba, to end the occupation in Puerto Rico, and also end the genocides in Palestine, Congo, and Sudan. And with many leaders speaking and saying and demanding the release of Nicolás Maduro and Celia Flores, these demands are constantly being unheard. And as Comrade Onye mentioned earlier, recently the United States forced Venezuelan oil ships to ship oil from Italy into occupied Palestine, also known, hopefully, inshallah, no longer soon as Israel. And this is something that is, a direct result of the hybrid warfare that the United States is launching against the international community in order to bring about unrelented domination, and also to force corruption further into the lands, in order to just hold control over the entire world, and essentially have no one be able to, speak out against what is happening, and being able to rise and resist. And this is something that, as we all know, and as revolutionaries and within the movement, we consistently condemn. I think that entering into dialogue is something that is very honorable, and is something that, if we can find a way, it is needed. But and as recently, the Cuban president Miguel Díaz-Canel said that they are open to dialogue and conversation with the United States, so as it's respectful and it actually resolves the atrocities that are happening right now as a result of the oil blockade. That's the only way to move forward. It's unlikely to see that the United States would answer with reason or even want to enter into reason because they are incapable of it. The United States has no moral conscience. And as we saw recently, as Kwame Ture has said of the United States, as we saw recently, this proverb comes to manifestation in the armed attack that happened against Cuba from the Floridian gusanos, who were financed and actually, provided with the weapons that were used during the aggression and the unwarranted attack, the terrorist attack that was launched, which they opened fire on Cuban soldiers who were, defending the shores of the nation, and it resulted in, I think, one or two gusanos dying and the others being injured and being treated. This is something that we see is a legacy within the United States, who has consistently launched terrorist attacks Cuba in order to find another way to be able to take over the nation. And this is something that, as I mentioned before, is rooted in the aim that they established in the Mallory Memo. It's something that was transformed and made into a legal mechanism under the Helms-Burton Act, which in the next episode of this talk show we'll talk more about. But as all things, the United States is only able to respond and communicate is through unwarranted and immoral violence. So the terrorist attack that happened recently against Cuba, of which they said that they are filing terrorism charges, is powerful because this flips the script that against the United States, where Trump redesignated them as the state sponsors of terrorism, while actively launching terrorist attacks in his second term and his second year in his administration and his dictatorship more so. And it shows that the actual ones who are the sole state sponsors of terror is the United States, as we see and have been saying, because of the genocide that they have been committing in Palestine, and also financing and manufacturing and facilitating against Sudan with the connections that they have with the reactionary nation of the United Arab Emirates, alongside other reactionary Arab states as well. So, Trump is showing the world the exact character that the prolific ruling class holds, and is actually giving more motivation to our revolutionary resolve and providing actual clarity in the sense of bringing about unification to rid the world, as Frantz Fanon says, of cleansing the world of the violence that is exerted by our oppressor. Cuba is doing this through legal means. So they are presenting the evidence, the weapons that are confiscated, the Florida flag boat that the armed groups used, and we're operating with impunity from U.S. soil. And this is the most direct challenge to the war on terror narrative that the United States has manipulated the masses that are still asleep to believe in order to continue allowing for these atrocities to continue onward. And Cuba has said, that they're going to put the gusanos in a pre-trial detention. They remain in prison there, and that they'll ensure that they receive due process. They're going to make sure that that they continue to act in defense of the people and of the country's institutions, because this is their primary, goal, and it's a principle that they hold very dear, which the imperialists do not hold in mind at all. And not to speak too much on this part, but I think it's important to note that this isn't the first terrorist attack that the United States has launched against Cuba. This actually is the Cuban authorities have documented approximately 5,780 separate terrorist attacks from the United States. One of the most notable ones that a majority of folks would probably know if they've been to Cuba and have visited the Playa Girón Museum, and as the Yankees know it as the Bay of Pigs. It was the attempt under the JFK dictatorship and his war criminal administration to be able to, launch another attack to destabilize the socialist Cuban revolution. And it was a failed attempt, as all of the other attempts that they have made. But this has led to, devastating consequences and has resulted in, the stealing of the future and lives of over 3,478 martyrs. And it's left thousands more with permanent disabilities. So, but the United States is essentially only, as Comrade Amia said, an exporter of terror. This is the only thing that they are good in doing. And as we see with the threats and the fear-mongering tactics that they have done in the Caribe by bombing fishermen in near Venezuela, near other Caribbean waters, as we saw with two brothers who were killed in Trinidad and Tobago, and more, unfortunately, have been consistently been killed in these illegal and unjustifiable bombings that continuously happen, so that we're not in communication with one another in the Caribbean and Latin America, and don't want to trade and send off much needed oil, material resources, food, whatever it is that our Cuban brothers and sisters need from nations at this time. This is done to prevent that continual relationship and care that is provided from nation to nation to continue into fruition. And as we see with these murders, right, this is a form of collective punishment, not only to the Cuban people, but to the international community as a whole. And Marco Rubio, a Gusano, whose parents left during the Bautista dictatorship, and who has never visited Cuba before, has consistently created a narrative essentially saying that, not only supporting Trump's designation of Cuba being on the SSOT list, but also saying that the Henry Reeves Brigade medical program is an act of human trafficking, and that these doctors are acting against their will, and that any nation or country that is essentially participating in this program will be sanctioned and completely blocked from doing relations with the United States. And it's something that is literally cutting a lifeline for many countries. Mexico was one of the countries that decidedly took a step back and then decided that they weren't going to allow that to that they weren't going to allow that to prevent them from being in complete solidarity and unity with Cuba at this time. And I think the last shipment that I saw that went, it was around like 2 million tons. So it was 2,000 tons, something around there. So this is a much needed aid that is going in, that is prevented from going in. And even to the point of, the doctors that are being attacked, that are providing life-saving, low-cost and free medical health procedures to the working class in these nations, predominantly the Afro and indigenous communities that aren't necessarily taken care of by their government because of restrictions within the nations themselves. this is a complete injustice to them. And some of the nations that have, adhered to the threats that Trump dictatorship has placed in the economical relationships of that are able to be made. Guatemala, Honduras, and recently Jamaica decided to call back doctors and nurses. And it's important to note that this is against the will of the people. And Honduras recently had a left-leaning government, and that was, unfortunately, she was voted out. Xiomara was voted out, and essentially like a far right leaning presidency took control over the nation and is acting against the will of the people. And this is what we see in these nations. And the people of Jamaica are lining up as much as they can to receive as much of the medical treatment that they could and they can for their cataracts and other medical procedures before the doctors are forced to leave. I think it's towards the end of this month. So this is a profound injustice, and it shows that the United States just views Nuestra América as their own playground to exert imperialist aggression and to go against the wishes of the people and essentially try to undermine the people's revolution. But this is something that they can't take away, and is why they continue to meet with one another in vain, as we saw and as we see with the Shield of America summit that happened in Doral, Florida, where I think it was over 10 or more reactionary leaders from Latin America and the Caribe met with the Epstein dictatorship of the United States. And some of these disgraceful leaders, if we can call them that, was Javier Milei from Argentina, from Bolivia, Costa Rica, Abinader, who is committing apartheid in the Dominican Republic, directly replicating the United States, Nayib Bukele in Salvador, who is in direct financial partnership with the Trump administration to essentially have the worst concentration camp known to the entirety of the Latin American, community, and is actually constantly giving advice to core civic group that is in charge of all of the concentration camps here in the United States. And as we see with the atrocities that are happening there, we know that this partnership that is being developed amongst the reactionary leaders is solely founded on, exerting, wrongfully so, continuing the legacy of imperialism, but then also attempting to take over the entire world to exert their exploitation and domination over our nations. And it's not so clear, right?
Can you look at the chat?
Huh?
Look at the chat.
Okay. I mean, if it's not so clear, him meeting with Jose Antonio Cast, who is also the son of a Nazi, then it's very clear in that regard. But I think it's important for us to remember that resistance is something that we are entitled to, and it's important to remember that permission to fight has been given to us, and Allah is sure to give us the victory because we are oppressed. And it's important for us to, support the fact that the Nuestra América Convoy is happening, and to bring about the form of resistance and unity that is very needed at this time. So, not to take too much time, But I would like to pose a question to my comrades. Essentially, just given all the points that we've discussed, all of the the imperialist developments that are unfortunately happening across the world that we must resist against. What are the points of unity that we can each identify, like in each struggle that we can struggle through with the masses to catalyze motivation and activation to actually bring about the success of accomplishing our means to bring about the end of imperialism and to develop a socialist class society globally and be able to bring about justice and peace into the world. So I open the floor to whoever would like to answer the question first.
You want to take it, Armaya? Or me?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I think, it's undeniable that the majority of Americans do not support any kind of imperialist aggression in other countries, right? Even though the government may. There's a new poll that just came out that showed the overwhelming majority of Americans rejected the interference that happened in Iran and the bombings that happened on the schoolgirls. And so I think we have to unify around this demand that, we do not want any kind of interference on our behalf. It cannot happen in our name. And we, as the people of America, will in fact stand up. We have to be able to show our government that they cannot do this so long as we resist, so long as we struggle against their efforts. And so I think that is probably one of the biggest demands that we need to unify around and organize ourselves on, as well as, showing the fact that this is a rich man's war. This is not working class people's war. Working class people did not ask for our money, our wealth that we have generated through our labor to be spent on bombs, to be spent on weapons, to be spent on bombing schoolgirls. And so I think as organizers in the Imperial Corps, we really need to emphasize that. And those two things are really our biggest two demands.
And the only thing I'd add is I feel like the bombings it's really wild, the Shield of the Americas summit that Jasenia mentioned that had all of the puppet leaders there, the president of El Salvador, president of Trinidad, president of Dominican Republic, the newly elected right-wing president of Honduras. They had all the ops of the Americas there, but the anti-imperialist countries were excluded as always. But they were up there smiling and cheesing with Marco Rubio and Trump and Kristi Noem, and not a word was said about the over 100 innocent people that have been murdered in the Caribbean, just like the U.S. decided that they were drug dealers and drone bombed fishing boats, and it's happened repeatedly since last year. Oh, also, they've apparently, reports recently came out that they killed 1,500 people with drones in Haiti. And so there's really a crisis of representation throughout Nuestra Americas, because we have all these governments in power, whether it's the United States, whether it's Honduras, whether it's El Salvador, whether it's Guatemala, all these puppet governments in power that are answering to the United States and ignoring the conditions of their people, all the way to the point of ignoring their people being murdered by the United States, not even asking for accountability, just following orders. And so it really shows us that there's no solutions for poor and working class people within the capitalist system, that the folks that gain power within that system do not represent the masses of people. They don't actually care about our lives. They don't care if we have healthcare. We don't care if we have education. They don't care if we have power. They don't care if we live or die. So we need to organize across borders to build the movement that can build the true kind of leadership we need to ensure we can live our lives, ensure we can be happy, ensure that we can organize society in the way that it needs to be organized. But yeah, there's a crisis of leadership that can only be addressed through mass organization of working people's movements in this region.
Yeah, I agree. And as we see, the puppet leadership that is being, erected by the imperialists who haven't stopped bombing innocent people in the Caribbean and Latin America. They're also, as they're bombing hundreds of fishermen they've bombed over 100 fishermen in the Caribe. The Israelis continue to do this to the fishermen in Palestine to prevent them from being able to, sustain themselves and feed themselves amongst and amidst a genocide. And as Comrade Mia had highlighted earlier, Israel receives free healthcare. They receive full subsidies and funding from the United States that comes from tax-paying dollars. I mean, I don't pay my taxes, but the people who do pay their taxes to fund this war machine, it's not going to be able to sustain ourselves, to have food sovereignty, to have healthcare, to have housing in the United States. And live dignified and respected lives, and they continuously attack Cuba, who do have all of these provisional measures, and take care of their people and ensure that they don't go without food or that they go without a medical treatment, and that they have somewhere respectable and adequate where to live, so that they don't need to worry about these things and are able to live their lives. They are consistently attacked by the United States. So it is important for us to, weave the interconnectedness as parts of our movements and of our struggles, and understanding that we have one enemy of which continues to exert and steal the innocence of our children and also of ourselves, as we're forced to mature and grow in a world that has only known war and genocide for centuries. And I think it's about that time where we all have to collectively come together and not just say no to imperialist aggression and no to war, but actually say no more and then bring that into reality. So I only had one question, not to take up too much time for the segment, but I think that the conversation that we had today is very pivotal and necessary, especially at this time. So I just wanted to thank you both for being and being in community and in space and time with me at this time.
Alrighty, so we're moving to the close of the show. First episode almost in the bag, but we want to share some NNOC updates with y'all. Updates from the National Network on Cuba's organizations. So first and foremost, we have been engaged in an internal battle of ideas within the network, directly inspired by the Cuban revolutionary process. We know that Cuba is a truly democratic society in that all sectors of Cuban society are organized and educated and able to give input and help collectively shape the vision of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban government. And so we really wanted to bring that practice into our organizing together within the Cuba Solidarity movement and engage in a debate about what the bylaws of the National Network on Cuba should be. So we have a set of bylaws that are about 20 years old that have served the organization quite well, but we have grown. There are many, many different movements represented within our formation. New structures and leadership have emerged that need to be formalized. And so we are in the process within the network of defining how our bylaws will be updated. We had a very, very successful debate last month where we discussed anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism, our points of practice and unity, and the need for us to continue to keep connecting the struggles against imperialism while also keeping Cuba in the center of our work. So after that debate and after a long process of internal discussions within the network, the co-chairs are currently working on an updated proposed new set of bylaws incorporating the input from that debate and discussion process. We are going to release that proposed new set of bylaws to the membership in April, and then we'll be engaging in a vote across the network on whether to adopt those new proposed bylaws at our spring-summer meeting happening Saturday, May 30th, 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern. That meeting will be virtual, so very, very accessible to participate if you want to join us. And also, obviously, we want as many of our network organizations represented there as possible, because that is the meeting where we'll be voting on the new bylaws and the direction our network is going to take moving forward. The other thing that's happening in the National Network on Cuba right now, the show is a part of it, is the Week of Action in Defense of Cuba. The entire national network is mobilizing and organizing virtual and in-person events across the United States to educate our communities about Cuba, to take action against the U.S. blockade on Cuba and the escalation of that blockade that's causing so much suffering on the island right now. There have been over 40 events in states as diverse as Florida, multiple events in Florida, by the way. Don't let anybody tell you that Florida does not love the Cuban Revolution, because we are here building, baby, and it includes Cuban Americans. So multiple events in Florida, multiple events in Nashville, in Colorado, in Utah, New York, New Jersey, going up. Like I think they had 3-4 events. Oregon, California, all over the country and online. National Network on Cuba organizations are organizing in defense of Cuba this week. And I'm about to put the link in the chat to where you can, Week of Action in, it's hard to type and talk, so let me just finish. Week of Action in Defense of Cuba events, okay, that's in the chat right now. And now I'm going to change the screen, hopefully, to a slideshow of flyers of events that are happening today and tomorrow all over the country. And theoretically, you should still be able to hear me. Let's see if it actually works. Can you hear me? I can hear myself. I see the line going up and down. So up on the screen, you should see flyers of events taking place across the country today, actually happening right now. So if you still have time to switch over after the show is over, the Defense Brigade's Coalition Working Group is having a roundtable discussion of revolutionary organizations talking about how we can better collaborate in defense of Cuba. It's called Support for Cuba Demands Unity. You can find that event on the NNOC website. Also happening today, we have International Quds Day 2026 in Houston, Texas, a coalition of anti-imperialist, Palestinian, and Cuba solidarity socialist organizations based in Houston, Texas, coming together in solidarity with Palestine, in solidarity with Cuba, in solidarity with all peoples across the world that are resisting imperialism. We also have in Brunswick, Maine, Let Cuba Live, a film screening and discussion organized by new members of the National Network on Cuba, well, new as of last year, Diaspora Parlante Collective, a Puerto Rican national liberation organization, Puerto Rico and Cuba, two wings of the same bird. They are hosting a screening with PSL in Maine of Let Cuba Live. They are going to be engaging in some fundraising and talking about a really great movie. So you can see all the events happening. Oh, I would be remiss not to mention the Defense of Brigade National Report Back that is happening tomorrow, the 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Virtually, we had two Defense Brigade last year, the African Indigenous Palestinian Brigade, as well as the Queer Brigade, and they are both contingents are coming together to discuss their experiences on the island and what is going on in Cuba today. So that is virtual. Please join us. I'll put the link in the chat. The other really great thing happening next weekend, or rather this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, is the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference organized by Cuba C, New York, New Jersey, and the International U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. It is a 2-day virtual and in-person New York City event bringing together Cubans, Cuban solidarity activists, and revolutionary organizers united in their opposition to the U.S. blockade on Cuba, who are actively working to normalize relations between Cuba and the U.S. So please check that out. The links to participate virtually just came out yesterday, so we're going to be publicizing that widely, and we encourage you to participate in both the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference as well as the VB National Report Back, and all of the events all over the country taking place in defense of Cuba this week. Next week on the show, in addition to the deep dive on the Helms-Burton Act that Ramia and Jasenia mentioned, we'll also be doing a recap of what happened during the week of action. But we just want to say we are so proud of all the organizations in the network and how we have come together in defense of Cuba in this critical moment. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ramia to close us out.
Everyone concludes our show for today. Thank you everyone for joining the first episode of Revolution Within the Revolution. Join us next Friday, March 20th at 1 p.m., where we will discuss the recap of the week of action for Cuba, the ExxonMobil Supreme Court case against Cuba's Cemex Corporation, and the legalities of these lawsuits under the Helms-Burton Act and the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. We are your hosts, Onya, Jasenia, and Ermia, and we will see you next week. Margbar.
La chemise zioniste.
Margbar.
La chemise capitaliste.
All power to the people, and thank you.
Anybody